right, everyone, welcome to tonight's History Talk, our very first one of the year. I hope that you've been enjoying and hopefully surviving this cold weather that we've been having here in our Midwestern region. Tonight, we'll be welcoming Doug Villhard here to talk about his most recent novel, The Golden Age of Red. Well, I'll give a brief bio of Doug before we get started. Doug Villhard is a professor of practice in entrepreneurship and the academic director for entrepreneurship at the Olin Business School in the Washington University in St. Louis. He started out his early career at Disney before becoming a serial entrepreneur, starting, selling, buying, advising, and investing in companies. Writing novels, golfing, acting in short films, and volunteering has been his side efforts while he's been pursuing his career, along with chasing his four children around, along with his wife, Diane. Doug has previously written two novels, Company of Women and City of Women, in the last 2 years. Today, he's going to be speaking with us about the lengths of his research and his interesting finds on his journey to write his most recent novel, The Golden Age of Red. I'll now turn it over to Doug. If you have any questions, feel free, speak up, or put them in the chat, and we'll get those answered.
Okay, great. Thanks, Will. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to see everybody. Yeah, if you want to interrupt me at any point, that would be fantastic. I think it'd be more fun for all of us. Plus, you're letting this guy who lives outside of Champaign talk to you about Champaign, right? So that's very risky. So there's a good chance that you're going to possibly know something that I don't. So look forward to that. So Red Grange. You're here. I'm gonna assume you know something about Red Grange. Probably know a lot about Red Grange living in Champaign. But 100 years ago, this was a view of Memorial Stadium on its dedication day. As some of you know, it was actually open a year before that, but they dedicated it 100 years ago in 1924. And it was just an amazing day, just in terms of the attendance that was there and just sort of pride in this sport and in Illinois and sort of, all things going on with college football. It wasn't the game was only invented a couple decades earlier, and it was just now sort of reaching its height. And then, as you guys know, they kicked the opening kickoff, and Red ran it all the way back. But that wasn't the only thing that he did. He scored 5 touchdowns, 4 on the ground and 1 passing. He also had 2 interceptions. He played on both sides of the ball. And it just led to sort of a national hysteria about this guy, Red Grange, because there was no video at the time, only print. So they just in their heads, they just sort of built him up to eventually hear a level of fame of that of Babe Ruth at the time, who coincidentally was out around this time with a stomach illness, and we could talk more about that later. But it just sort of created this opportunity for Red to hit the national spotlight. And the book's called The Golden Age of Red because it's really considered to be the golden age of sports journalism too. And where they're waxing on and writing poems and really starting this sort of hero worship today. And Red was right in the middle of that. And then after that game, everyone wanted to come and interview him. From the New York Times to the Chicago Tribune, to all national media came, and it was just this great story because he's really shy, actually, and really humble. And he'll say, "Oh, I don't even know why people are fussing about me. You should be talking about the folks that are blocking for me, or my genius coach." He just was really good at just a great character in that sense. And eventually leading to him being on the cover of Time magazine. With this 100 years ago, he was a junior, and then his senior year on Time magazine. Imagine that as a young man, that happening right at the beginning of the season, and just the crowds that would form for him everywhere he went, and all starting from that big game 100 years ago at the dedication. But interestingly enough, he was an All-American already the year before. And last thing I'll say before I move on is that you could only play 3 years in college. You could not play your freshman year. So that those were the rules. So he achieved all of this as a sophomore, junior, and senior. So just fascinating, just 3 years. And this was common. This was common. What he would run into as he went into different towns and such like that. And this was the 20s and flappers and such. And you guys in Champaign have done a great job of remembering Red and his coach, Bob Zupke. There was an exhibit at your museum recently with his coach was actually a prolific painter, and that red arrow is they're going to Red Grange next to his coach. So it's just been a great story that has been around for a long time. And if you're an Illinois football fan, and you watched the 100-year anniversary of that game, you saw that they rolled out the red green jerseys or the jerseys of that time, and that just happened a couple months ago, and it was just a really great move by the University of Illinois. The way they painted the helmets to look like leather helmets and sort of had those throwback jerseys. It just really not only did it catch the national attention, but the same thing 100 years ago, Michigan was coming into that game, the national champions, just like they were this year, too. And in both years, Illinois pulled through with the win. So really fun. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is a little more detail on kind of what made Red famous and what brought him into the national spotlight. And I thought I would show you some of the research that I did too to lead to this. So again, you're welcome to ask a question anytime, chat or verbal or whatever you like, and I'll certainly take questions at the end. But I wanted to show you how I dove into this story. So first of all, I went to the archives at the University of Illinois. And if you look in the upper left there, you see that scrapbook, right? 100 years ago, they don't have Facebook, right? They don't have the internet, but scrapbooks were very popular. I got the sense that they sold them in the bookstore, and it was very popular for students to chronicle their time while they were in college. And several of these scrapbooks were donated back to the archives. And I found the ones that overlapped the time when Red Grange was there. And all of them had a page or so they were scrapbooking their own college careers, but all of them stopped and had a page or two on Red Grange, right? So it was really fun to see that. It was fun to see. I wouldn't have known. I was able to work it into the story that they had dance cards. Um, I don't know. I guess I thought maybe dance cards were something from like the 1700s, or Bridgerton or something like that. But it was interesting that just 100 years ago, dance cards were very popular. And there was also you could see what a ticket looks like in the upper right there, and some of the cartoons and such that were in the newspaper at the time. So I really wanted to get a sense that there's information everywhere about how many touchdowns he scored and all that kind of stuff. But I really wanted to get a sense of what college life was like at the time, and it was surprisingly very similar to today in a lot of different ways. As I'm sure many of you have been to, I was able to tour the Virginia Theater, which is beautiful, and that plays a big part into this story, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then I was also able to go to Wheaton, Illinois, Red's hometown, and some of his archives are stored there too in Wheaton College, and that's me with one of his uniforms. Which, if I had not done that research, I would not have realized that. I knew they wore sweatered uniforms, but I didn't realize they were onesies. I didn't realize that they clipped under the crotch like that. I just had no idea. So it was fun to, when you do this kind of stuff, you can really work some details, especially if you're trying to tell a story, like I am today. And I don't know if you all have ever done this before. I'm sure there's some historians there too, but you can see me in the lower right there with like white gloves on and such. And, being very delicate to open these things one at a time, look through them, make my notes, put them back exactly how I found it. So it was really fun doing this. And of course, I've done this for all of my books, but it was fun to do it in Wheaton and in Champaign as well. So just a little bit about Red. He's from Wheaton, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. And he was a sports star in high school, but they didn't really recruit like they did today and such like that. And especially Coach Zupke, he just felt like the best kids in Illinois should go to Illinois. and he usually had hundreds trying out for the team, and he usually had, they didn't really carry a team of much more than 20 because they played both sides of the ball like soccer is today. So he didn't need a ton of kids. So he just kind of picked through them. But one of the neat things about Red and his brother Garland was they were icemen in the summer. So remember, we don't have refrigerators at this time. We have, and I know you know the term, we have ice boxes, right? That literally had ice in them. So if you're an ice man, you're lifting 50 to 100 pound blocks of ice all the time. And it's really interesting. It gave Red a muscle definition that many of the other players did not have. They didn't have weight rooms at the time. So this is a really strong guy because of his choice of summer job, and he's from Wheaton. They actually called him the Wheaton Iceman. He has a lot of different nicknames before we get to the Galloping Ghost. So kind of fun part of his story. And after he ran those touchdowns, and the journalists discovered this, it really also helped lead to the lore of Red and people wondering how big he might be and how muscular he is. He's actually only about 5'10" and 180 pounds. But for then, that's a big guy, apparently. And it was fun to learn about his family life too. When Red's brother Garland was 2 years younger than him, and also at University of Illinois. And Red's dad was huge. He was a jailer. He was a lumberjack. And in fact, the thing about his jail was they didn't even lock it because as a jailer, no people were too afraid to take him on, so they would just sit in their cell until they went to lunch or whatever they had to do. So he come from that kind of family, and his mother died when he was very young, which made for an interesting thing about Red. We know him as the football star and all that, but there's a lot about how Red was really a matriarch more than a patriarch in his household, in the sense that he really took care of his little brother and he took care of the house, and he, traditional at the time, like cooking and such like that. Like that was really his focus. And a lot of times when you talk to Red, what he was more focused on is like, where's his brother right now? And how's his brother doing right now? And it just kind of led to this nurturing kind of humble personality that is the lore of Red. So it was fun to research that too and to work that into the book. Um, he also, while he was at Illinois, played for Coach Zupke, who we talked about a little earlier, and who's a prolific painter. And that's a painting of Zupke's there with a dejected player on the bench. Um, but Red will be the first to tell you, and so will I, that Zupke is a genius. He is a genius. I'm not saying that Red does not deserve the credit that he had for being an exceptional athlete, but Zupke invented things. He wasn't just a coach. He was an inventor in the game, like the screen pass, like the fake punt, all kinds of different plays like that we know today originated from Zupke. In fact, the other football coaches did not like him very much. They called him Mr. Razzle Dazzle. And the reason that they didn't like that is they would just prefer to get the biggest kids possible, give them the ball, and run up the middle. But all of a sudden, when you're playing the Zupke team, all of a sudden he could punt on first down and catch you off guard. And then he could do a fake punt and catch you off guard. He could do a screen pass. So he really changed the game at the time. So we've got this nice this nice opportunity of sort of hero worshiping at the time. 1920s, we're getting out of World War I. We have more disposable income, and then we have this genius coach here in Champaign who sees something in this kid. Also at the time were very famous sports journalists who would come to town. And these are journalists that are syndicated now across all of these papers. So they really led to this as well. And the same Grantland Rice on the right there. If you guys have ever heard of the Four Horsemen, which are the backfield of the University of Notre Dame. Interestingly enough, Rice wrote the Four Horsemen lore on the same day when Red scored those touchdowns. That game against Army was in New York that day. So he's actually typing this about the four horsemen when he gets over the wire, this thing that happened with Red, and that happened in real life too. So it was really everything was kind of converging then too, and Babe Ruth and all the other big sports names that we know of the time. But what drew me to the story wasn't Red at all, or I'm sorry to say, or the Golden Age, or Zupke, or Champagne, or anything. I'm an entrepreneurship professor, and I'm really interested in entrepreneurial minds, especially ones who are ahead of their time. And CC Pyle, I'll give it away here. CC Pyle today is known as America's first sports agent. But what he was, as many of you know, is the manager of the Virginia Theater. And he himself had wanted to be a thespian and be a movie star, and he was 40 at this time, and Red's 20 at this time. And CC Pod just he's kind of lucky to have a job at this point. But he gave this era as if he owned the theater, and in fact, two theaters in town, as if he owned it. But when you dig into the records of it, he did not. A builder owned it, but he was the front man for it, and it was very popular during to play movies at that time. They were silent films, and it's very popular for someone like CC Pyle to come out at the beginning, talk to everybody about what they're going to see today, maybe introduce a variety show, such like that, talk about things that are happening in Champaign, and then roll the picture. So he sort of had that role too. But when he saw all the fame that was coming down on Red, he saw this opportunity. He saw this opportunity that Red could be something bigger, something bigger than even Red had considered. And at the time, the NFL was not what it is today, not even close to what it is today. College football was huge and drawing 80,000 people, or 67 here in Champaign, 80,000 in Ohio State. But pro games like the Bears were drawing about 2,000 people. And everybody thought that football should take off, but just the most people didn't know it. They didn't go to college. This was a college sport, so they didn't really understand it. And CC Pyle had the vision to say, if football had a Babe Ruth, if football had a Babe Ruth, this could take off. So Pyle saw that early and read and whispered into his ear about what his potential could be. And you have to remember at the time, Red's family is not, his dad's a jailer. Red's family is not very wealthy. There are no athletic scholarships. Red is paying, his father actually is paying to go to school, $500, by the way, paying to go to school. And Red has to work in the summer, and he's lucky to have money. And often Red thought about, I should quit football and get a job because of how expensive this is. So you've got a kid in sort of this situation who's all of a sudden becoming as famous as Babe Ruth, and you've got CC Pyle on the scene to kind of put all the pieces together. And then CC Pyle did a fantastic job of getting George Halas, who owns the Bears, and Tim Mara, who owns the Giants, to go against each other to help the bidding war to try to figure out who can get Red Grange. And of course, they felt like they should talk to Red Grange. They'd never talked to an agent before, but Red said, "Hey, talk to CC Pyle about all this." And he played it off to a point where what happened in his interview with George Halas, the owner of the Bears, is George Halas said, "Listen, I'm paying players generally about 100 or 200 a game. I'm willing to pay Red $500 a game." And on his own, Red would have taken that. It would have been amazing. But right, that's what college tuition costs for a year, and he's willing to get that for a whole game. That's amazing. And CC Pyle said that's a great place to start. But George Halas of the Bears, I was thinking this. I was thinking half. And George Halas like, half of what? And CC Pyle says the gate. Half the gate. And George said, "Well, I wouldn't be able to afford that." He says, and CC Pyle said, "Look, you're drawing 2,000 people right now. If you sign Red, you'll start drawing 60 to 80,000 per game. So basically what I'm saying to you is let's split the difference." And that's the deal that he got. And by the way, after that, shortly after the couple years of Red and CC Pyle, all sports, pro sports, all of them banned agents until the 1960s. We don't have sports agents from CC Pyle all the way to the 60s because of how powerful they were. as a negotiator. So that was what initially drew me to the story. And then and Red takes it, and Red cashes in. And and he doesn't just cash in playing on the field, he makes movies too. And I think when I was a kid, I thought Michael Jordan and Space Jam, I think I thought that was like the first time a sports person was ever in movies, but obviously they have been in movies before. I just didn't realize it as a kid. But this is your first sports star starring in movies here, in sometimes racing movies, football movies, secret agent movies. So it's really neat. And the thing was, Red is really actually shy and wasn't at the time a great speaker, but it was silent film, and he moved really nice, and he was handsome for the time. So and he was famous. So he could help to sell out these films. So it was really fun to research that and to work that into the book. And then, of course, someone as famous as Red is going to get photographed with every famous person of the time. Here's Babe Ruth, and the lower right is Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And then I don't know that everyone knows Marion Davies, but that was actually Red's favorite. She's a beautiful, beautiful person. She was not married to, but dating Randolph Hearst at the time, who was estranged from his wife. So it's just really interesting. Red in the middle of all of this in the 1920s, and there's just sort of photo after photo, publicity photo, or him with his shirt off. And by the way, if you look at his muscle tone there, that is a really cut person for the 1920s. Maybe compared to today, but just a gasp. And the way that, if you look in the lower left there, the way that people wrote fan mail for him was unprecedented at the time. And it was sort of two groups of that mail. One is young kids wanting an autograph from Red, and the other one is girls sending pictures of themselves. Not like not naughty pictures. Well, sometimes, but like pictures of themselves. So, he is just inundated with this. And I don't know if it's true, but it's what they say is true. He would take all the girl photos and throw them in the trash and write back to every kid that wrote to him. This is the kind of persona that Red is. And he loved sports cars too. And this was the height of that too. So seeing him in these cars was just, the envy of every young athlete and person, not unlike it is today. So he really was the first to sort of have the blueprint of what today we would call the professional athlete. It hadn't really happened before him. And the other thing that CC Pyle did was he said, you know what, you're not going to be able to play football forever. So let's also make money on endorsements. So we've got Red in candy bars. We've got the Red Grange doll there. It's a little creepy. I got to hold that in Wheaton. But what they really did on the left there is, after a year of playing, they said, we don't want to be part of the Bears. We want our own NFL team. And we're going to call them the New York Yankees. And Red's going to be the Babe Ruth of the New York Yankees football team. And the owner of the New York Giants, Tamara, had exclusive rights in New York, so he did not allow it. He would not allow it to happen. So Red and CC Pyle formed their own league. So instead of the NFL, they formed the AFL and took the lead, took the league straight on. And many people called it the Red Grange League, actually competing against the NFL at the time. So imagine you're Red, and you've got CC Pyle in your ear, and he's saying, no, Red, we're not talking about playing football, and we're not talking about movies, and we're not talking about endorsements, and we're not talking about having our own team. We're talking, Red, about having our own league, owning the entire league, right? This is the vision that these guys went after. And all great stories, right? All great stories go up, they go down, and they come back up again. And in terms of down, Red got hurt. He was almost as fast as the Olympic record holder at the time running, but his knee blew out. And after that, he himself would say, he was a great football player. And after his knee blew out, he would be the first to admit that now I'm a good football player. I was a great football player, and now I'm a good football player. So it was kind of tragic to watch this and the downfall and financial ruin and basically CC Pyle driven off the entire sports scene at the time. But on CC Pyle's way out, he tried everything he could to get more cash for him and Red, including staging a running race to promote at the time Route 66. He had runners run from California all the way to Route 66 to Chicago, all the way to Madison Square Garden in New York City. And poor Red had to like go along with his cane and be like the what do they call the parade master for this, basically, because he had no money at that time. And this was their sort of last ditch effort to pull that off. And it didn't work very well. So at this point, Red's out. But then, like all great stories and all great heroes. I'm sorry. Well, that'll be in a moment. Also, at his weakest point too, there's a paternity suit against him as well, and many things like that going on too in his personal life, which makes its way into the book too. But at the end of all that, though, he gets back up and trains and trains and trains until he's at a point where he can return to football. And his brother Garland joins him for the Chicago Bears. And they have today, as far as I know, I believe they're the only ones to have it, a brother-to-brother touchdown reception in the NFL, something they'd always hoped that he could do. And then went back to the Bears, basically hat in hand, and played for them through the Depression until his playing days were over. He lived to be almost 90, and ended up being inducted into the Hall of Fame for the NFL. Also was a play-by-play person when television came out. He often did play-by-play for college games and such like that, and was back at Illinois for each year, the 25th and 50th, as they rededicated their stadiums again during those time periods. He came back. So I'm sure he would have come back a couple of months ago if he was still alive. So he was still heralded by Illinois this entire time. But it was just a fascinating story to research and to learn more about in the sort of the business side of sports and the game itself. And as I was promoting the book a couple months ago, I got to go to that dedication game. I'm in that middle photo there in the lower left up on the big screen, all that kind of stuff. That was really fun to promote the book and be on radio. And on the right there, this was inside the stadium. You could see his cleats from that day, and the ball in his uniform and such like that. So it's really special for me, having researched that, to be part of your big game. So I'm coming up for air here, but this was the Red Grange story. This was my research on it, and I'm sure you know a lot about him. Maybe you'd like to share some of that too. But I thought I'd sort of lay out maybe a couple things that you didn't know before about Red Grange. And at this point, if you want to, just sort of create an opportunity to see if anybody wants to talk about it a little bit, or ask me questions. But thanks for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Doug. At the very least, we'll now welcome the floor up. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask. At the very least, I'll kick us off. Aside from that absolutely terrifying doll that you featured in your presentation, one thing I was wondering is if you found any account, since C.C. Pyle himself was interested in appearing in movies and short films, do you think that possibly influenced Red's own path and career ship, influencing him to also look into the world of movies as well?
Yeah. So yeah, very much. C.C. Pyle knew Charlie Chaplin and other folks like that, and came up in those ranks. He was a thespian himself. C.C. Pyle worked at a traveling theater company, where he would go ahead a week or two ahead of time and drum up interest for the show, and then he would also act in the show himself. So yes, his what CC Pyle did with Red is CC Pyle wishes he was Red. This is really about him and him being in the national spotlight. And when you look closely at the race and the movie posters, it always says like CC Pyle presents, for example. So yes, this is very much was a manifestation of a career CC Pyle wished that he had, and he was able to use Red to achieve it for a short period of time. Oops.
Oh, Tom, it looks like you're wanting to ask a question, but you're muted.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yep. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Um, this is regarding CC Pyle and the part you were talking about, Route 66. Uh, we we drove Route 66 from Chicago to LA
Yeah.
back in May, and before I went, I did some reading on the history of it because I did a presentation myself on Route 66 after I got back, and just one point first is, as I understand, when they got to Chicago, and I don't know if this was Pyle's idea or not, they decided, well, there was still some things to do. So they had them run all the way to New York. The original idea was just Route 66. And I can't remember what the time factor was, but it was phenomenal. And they used to have these kinds of races back then. But on to CC Pyle. Um, were there other people that he came to promote other than Red Grange? He kind of developed a stable of athletes and other people as well, or was he really? I mean, Red Grange was his money ticket, and he stayed with him.
Yeah, great question. So first of all, he's known today as America's sports agent, but that wasn't the word that they used at the time. They used the word promoter.
Mm.
So he didn't have the vision that he would represent all the players.
Mm-hmm.
But he had the vision that he would own the league, and not let the players have that kind of power. Basically, he wanted to go up the ladder, so he didn't see himself like that. But what he did do, though, was in addition to football, he also did tennis, which
Oh.
which at the time was only an amateur sport.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been a good thing to mention too. He really thought amateur athletes were getting taken advantage of, and he
Mm-hmm.
thought college players should be paid, which they are today, if you're paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to this. So he thought that 100 years ago. But tennis, you couldn't play in the top, like Wimbledon and those, you couldn't play in the top tournaments if you were a pro, only as an amateur.
Mm-hmm.
It was a sport designed for rich people, basically, and their kids. So it was hard. Poor people couldn't. There was no way to make a living. But so he took some of the ones that were more of that, like Red, that weren't born rich, and started a pro tennis league, and took a
No.
took a tour across the United States. And he did it with this woman named Suzanne Legdon, and she is a great story in the 1920s because you know what she said? She said, I love playing tennis, except I don't know why I have to play in a dress that goes all the way down to the grass. And she said, screw it. I'm going to let the dress go up over my sock line, right? Scandalous. And then she said, I don't know why I have to play tennis with the ruffles on my sleeve that touch my hand. I'm scooting my sleeve up.
Mm-hmm.
And don't take this the wrong way, please. She's like, I don't know why I have to play. Please don't take this the wrong way. Like a girl, like where we just like can't move and we hit it back and forth at the time. She's like, I'm going to play like a man and run all over the place and hit it hard. So she was really the star of his show, and people didn't like her. You know how people are. They don't like the newest trends and such like that. But he said, you know what? People will pay more for somebody they hate
Yeah.
than somebody they love, right? Just exactly like the promoter of Elvis used to say as well. So thanks for that. Thanks for that question. He didn't have a vision for representing more athletes. He had a vision for owning all the leagues.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how long did he live and
Yeah, he lived, he
continue?
lived he lived pretty long too. He lived another couple decades, but most of it destitute. He was a barker at the Chicago World's Fair, like standing outside of a Ripley, believe it or not,
Gosh.
type thing. But he did toward the end a very interesting thing for those that might love I Love Lucy. In I Love Lucy, there's a famous scene where Lucy's at the chocolate factory and she's eating those chocolates, right? She's trying to eat them as
Yeah.
fast before they go by. The supervisor of that, the mean boss lady, was CC Pyle's wife later in life. So he was still around Hollywood back then. Yeah.
Oh,
Hi,
fascinating.
Thanks
hi,
for the
Doug. Oh,
yes.
Doug, I have a question. Do you happen to know, there are two huge sculptures in front and the back of the stadium.
Yeah.
Um, are they any significance about this sculpture? When or who did them?
Yeah, great question. So yes, there is a it's almost eight times larger than Red statue
Mhm.
of Red Grange at the stadium. Um, and get this, they wanted to erect that statue all the way back in 1925 when he was graduating. They wanted to do it then, and Red said, absolutely not. I want nothing to do with the statue of myself. And by the way, I'll get to the present one in a second. And by the way, back then they wanted to do the statue of Red naked
Oh, why?
because like Olympians, ancient
Oh,
Olympians,
I see.
right, are
Okay.
naked, and he's got this muscle structure.
Mm,
So he definitely wanted nothing to do. He wanted nothing to do with that either. But his whole life he fought it. Fought it,
mm,
fought it. He was even on the board of trustees there. Fought it, fought it, fought it. So it was about a decade after his death
mm,
that they did it and couldn't. He was just that humble of a person, if you will. But I've never seen a statue like it. I've never seen one that big. And I
mm,
think it was Illinois' way of saying this wasn't just a player. And I may have left it out a little bit, but this was a player who put football really
mm,
on the map and really put the NFL on the map and really created, the celebrity athlete too. So that's the significance of that and why it took longer.
Who was the sculptor? Do you
Yeah,
know?
there is. It's two Google searches away. You'll find
Yeah.
it, and when you do that, you'll be able to watch like a 10-minute video of that sculptor designing it and his
Mm,
concepts, and then getting it all the way there and installing it. It's a wonderful YouTube video that you can
okay.
watch. Yeah, yeah. But thanks for asking. Yeah, it's a great part of history there. And when I
There,
was
there was some small scale sculpture, the same sculpture. It's
yeah.
like a miniature. I
Yeah,
don't know.
yeah, that's right. And of course, I have my little fun sculptures too here. They sell these at the Illinois games and such like that. That's just a bobblehead. But it was also fun
Mm,
to find helmets too of that time, and just to see how little protection
mm,
there was. And it's interesting, it didn't have really anything to do with protecting your head. They didn't
mm,
like their ears getting ripped off, so
mm,
it was more about keeping your ears from getting ripped off than anything, except
mm,
that coach we were talking about, Zupke, in the late 20s came out with a design to try to protect players' heads. uh,
mm.
so it was really really interesting to see that too over time.
Thank you.
All right,
um,
just before we have any other questions in person, there was just a couple of notes in our chat.
yeah.
Charlie typed, when Red was at the U of I, he was also a model for Joseph Koons and Company, which is a department store in downtown Champaign. There are newspaper ads in the Champaign County History Museum files of this event and of his modelship. So at the very least, if you wanted to see that or learn a little bit more about that, you can do so here at the museum.
And if I could just say something about it real quick, CC Pyle hated that. He hated that, and I think that might, if that happened after he was pro, different. But there were some people using his name, Red's name, image, and likeness amongst the business owners in town while he was in college, and Red hated that. Or I'm sorry, CC Pyle hated that. Thought Red should be compensated for that. But that's really interesting to see those. We'll have to look at the dates of those and see if it was when he was a pro, I would assume, and not when he was a college student.
I would assume so as well. The other question we had from the chat was from Tom, and he was asking where we can buy your book.
Oh, well, that's really kind. Yeah, it's maybe Will, you could put it in a link in there for me. You can just go to Amazon and find it and drop it in. Or DougVillhard.com if you want a signed one. It's the same price. But yeah, I chose to do it in the form of historical fiction, as opposed to nonfiction. And the reason is it's very simple. I think it's more fun. I think it's more fun, and I basically stay true to the storylines. Obviously, I have to embellish here and there, but it is a book. It's absolutely a book. But I try to write them as if you're watching the movie, actually, about this, and I just have more fun in that medium. So it's really fun to research all this stuff, and then a lot of times nonfiction will tell you what happened, but in fiction sometimes I can get more into the why and how it felt. So that's the choice that I made.
I've posted the link for both your and the Amazon's website, so people can check those out and see both the books that you've written so far, as well as just keep an eye on anything else that you write. Otherwise, before we continue, does anyone else have any questions? Anyone else in the chat would like to ask a question to Doug? All right, it doesn't appear so. Well, then, at the very least, let's just give a final thank you to Doug for joining us tonight. It was wonderful to have him here as our first history talk of the year, and it was certainly on a topic that I'm sure we are all very interested in and are very excited to know a little bit more about.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, everybody. And I loved my time in Champaign and visiting. And I want you all to know, I don't know if you realize this, but Sports Illustrated is basically calling what Red did that day 100 years ago most unforgettable moment in sports. I mean, you think of like all the sports moments, right? All levels, all genders, everything that happened in your town 100 years ago, and I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to tell that story. And I'm a proud owner of just about all of your memorabilia that has to deal with it too. So I really enjoyed being part of it, and hopefully maybe you guys learned something new about Red Grange, and I think I did too today. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Just before we end for tonight, the last thing that I want to make sure everyone is aware of is if you are interested in continuing to learn a little bit more about our local football history, our next history talk next month on, I believe it's February 20th, is going to continue this trend. We will be having the authors of the 100 Years Memorial Stadium that was published for the centennial last year. Professor Kevin Hinders and Benjamin Bross will be here and will be speaking about the research that went into their book and to tell us a little bit more about the history of Memorial Stadium. But if there's no other comments, questions, or concerns, at the very least, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight, and I hope to see you at next month's History Talk.